The road down from the high plains of Moab is steep, sun-scorched, and unforgiving, and 3 women have stopped walking on it. Below them, hidden in heat shimmer, lies the deep trench of the Jordan Valley, among the lowest, hottest ground on earth, and beyond it, the long climb up into the hill country of Judah. Behind these women lie 2 empty households and 3 husbands buried in foreign soil. The older woman stops first. Naomi turns, her face hollowed by grief and hunger both, and tells her 2 daughters-in-law to go home, back to their mothers, back to the gods and the fields and the futures that still belong to them here in Moab. One daughter-in-law kisses her mother-in-law's cheek, weeping, and turns back toward the only home she has ever known. The other does not move. Ruth stands in the dust of that descent, a Moabite woman about to do something almost no one in her world would expect. Bind her life permanently to a people not her own, a God not her own, and a future with no guarantee in it at all. This is Bible Stories Unearthed, where we retell the narratives of Scripture alongside the history, archaeology, and ancient world that give them their full weight. Today, the story of a Moabite widow who chose loyalty over safety and became, against nearly every social expectation of her world, the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. To understand what Ruth is walking into, it helps to understand the border she has just crossed. The story is set in the period the Bible calls the time of the Judges, the early Iron Age, roughly the 12th to 11th centuries BC, after the older Bronze Age order of the region had already collapsed. Israel in this period had no king and no centralized government, a loose collection of tribal territories, governed locally by elders, held together by shared ancestry and a shared God. Life was agrarian and precarious. One failed harvest could mean famine, which is exactly what has just happened. Across the Jordan and the Dead Sea lay Moab, a distinct people devoted to their own god, Chemosh, and at this early stage organized much like Israel itself, loosely around clans and territory rather than under a single throne. Moab and Israel were neighbors with a long, complicated history, sometimes trading, sometimes at open odds, as the Book of Judges records elsewhere. And Israelite law went further than rivalry. It formally barred Moabites from full inclusion in Israel's religious community, a restriction that makes what's about to happen in this story genuinely remarkable. It begins, as so much of the Bible's hardship does, with hunger. A famine strikes Bethlehem, a name that itself means house of bread, and a man named Elimelech leads his wife Naomi and their 2 sons out of Judah and across the border into Moab in search of food in a land that still has it. They settle there. The sons grow up and each marries a Moabite woman, Orpah and Ruth. For a decade this works. Then it stops working entirely. Elimelech dies. Then both sons, Mahlon and Chilion, die as well, leaving 3 widows with no husbands, no sons, and in the ancient world, almost no legal standing at all. A woman without a husband or a son to inherit through had no guaranteed claim to land, income, or protection. Widowhood here was not simply grief. It was vulnerability of the most practical kind. Naomi hears that the famine in Bethlehem has finally broken, and she decides to go home. On the road, she tells Orpah and Ruth to turn back, to return to their mother's houses in Moab, where they at least have family who can shelter them and a real chance at remarriage. It is the kinder, more practical advice. Orpah, weeping, agrees and turns back. Ruth refuses in words that have outlasted nearly every other line in the book. "Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." It's worth sitting with what this actually costs her. Ruth isn't simply choosing Naomi. She's renouncing her own nation, her own God, and her own legal protections to walk into a country that, by its own law, doesn't fully welcome people like her. The two women arrive in Bethlehem with nothing. Naomi is so changed by grief that she tells the townswomen to stop calling her Naomi, meaning pleasant, and call her Mara instead, bitter. It is barley harvest season, and Ruth, as the younger and more able-bodied of the two, goes out to glean. Gleaning was a real, legally required form of survival in ancient Israel, not an act of charity left to individual goodwill. Israelite law required landowners to leave the edges of their fields unharvested and to leave behind any grain that fell during the harvest, specifically for the poor, the widowed, and the foreigner to collect. It functioned as a built-in social safety net, and it's the reason Ruth, a foreign widow with nothing, is able to feed herself and Naomi at all. As it happens, though the text frames it as anything but coincidence, the field Ruth gleans in belongs to a man named Boaz, a relative of Naomi's late husband Elimelech, a man of standing and means. Boaz notices her. He's already heard about her loyalty to Naomi, and he goes well beyond what the law requires. He tells his workers to deliberately leave extra grain for her, invites her to eat with his harvesters, and makes sure she's protected from harassment in the field, something a foreign woman gleaning alone would have had real reason to fear. Naomi recognizes the name immediately. Boaz isn't just a kind landowner. He's a close relative, close enough to be what the law called a goel, a kinsman-redeemer, someone with both the right and the responsibility to act on behalf of the family if its line and land were in danger of disappearing entirely. Naomi sends Ruth to the threshing floor after dark, where Boaz is sleeping beside the harvested grain to guard it from thieves. Ruth waits until he has eaten and settled for the night, then moves quietly through the dark, uncovers his feet, and lies down. In the middle of the night, Boaz wakes with a start to find someone there. When he asks who it is, Ruth gives her name and makes her request plainly, in the language of the old custom, that he extend his protection over her, as a guardian with both the right and the duty to act for her family. It is, unmistakably, an appeal for marriage and for redemption. Boaz is moved and he agrees, but he's honest with her about a complication. There's a kinsman even closer in line than himself, and that man has the first legal right to redeem the family's land, and with it, the responsibility tied to marrying Ruth. The next morning, Boaz settles it the way Israelite law required such things to be settled, publicly, at the city gate, in front of witnesses. He puts the matter to the closer kinsman directly. The man can redeem Elimelech's land, but it comes bundled with marrying Ruth and raising up an heir to carry on her dead husband's name. The kinsman hesitates, taking that on risks damaging his own estate, and declines. To finalize the transfer, he removes his sandal and hands it to Boaz, an old legal custom for sealing a transaction, one the text itself pauses to explain to its readers, since by the time it was written down, the custom evidently needed explaining. Boaz redeems the land. He marries Ruth. A son is born, Obed. The women of Bethlehem, who once watched Naomi return to them as Mara, Now place the baby in her arms and tell her this child will renew her life and sustain her in old age. And then the book closes with something unusual for a story about two ordinary struggling widows, a genealogy, and a small puzzle folded inside it. The whole point of the legal arrangement at the gate had been to preserve the name of Ruth's dead husband, Mahlon, but the closing genealogy records Obed as the son of Boaz outright, tracing the line from Boaz to Obed to Jesse to David, the David who will become Israel's greatest king. Exactly how those two things fit together, a child raised to carry one man's name while recorded as another man's heir, is something the text itself never fully spells out. What it does make unmistakably clear is this: a Moabite widow who arrived in Bethlehem with nothing but loyalty and a foreign accent stands at the root of the most important family line in the entire Hebrew Bible. Moab itself is not a literary invention. It's solidly attested archaeologically, but the dating needs careful handling. The clearest evidence is the Mesha Stele, a stone inscription commissioned by a Moabite king named Mesha in the 9th century BC and discovered in 1868 at Dibon in modern Jordan. It confirms that Moab eventually consolidated into a powerful, centralized kingdom with its own throne, its own military conflicts with Israel, and its own national god, Chemosh. But the Mesha Stele describes Moab roughly 2 centuries after the period this story is set in. During the actual Iron Age 1 setting of Ruth, the evidence suggests Moab, like Israel across the river, was still a looser network of agro-pastoral clans, not yet the organized state the stele later describes. The fully formed kingdom belongs to a later chapter of Moab's own history. The gleaning laws described in the narrative are genuinely attested in Israelite legal texts, in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, as real codified provisions for the poor, not narrative invention. The kinsman-redeemer custom is more complicated. What Boaz does blends two separate legal ideas, redeeming family land and continuing a dead man's family line through marriage, in a way that isn't spelled out together anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible. And the book's own closing genealogy, which records Obed under Boaz's name rather than Mahlon's, only deepens the puzzle. Scholars continue to debate exactly how the custom operated in practice. What's clearer is the dating of the text itself. The book's habit of pausing to explain its own customs to its audience, like the sandal exchange, is one of several details that lead most scholars today to date its final written form later than the events it describes, though how much later, and on what grounds exactly, remains genuinely debated. Ruth's story endures because it refuses to let loyalty be simple. She owes Naomi nothing by any legal or religious obligation of her time. No law required her to leave her homeland, her family, or her God for a woman with no means left to repay her. She does it anyway. The Hebrew word the book uses for this kind of loyalty, hesed, doesn't translate cleanly into English. It sits somewhere between kindness, loyalty, and covenant faithfulness, devotion that asks nothing in return. Ruth shows it to Naomi. Boaz shows it to Ruth. And the story rewards that devotion in a way none of its characters could have anticipated, placing a foreign widow at the root of a royal line in a society whose own laws had explicitly tried to keep someone like her out. That tension between exclusion written into the law and inclusion written into the story is one this book never quite resolves. It simply leaves it standing. If this story has stayed with you, Bible Stories Unearthed has a growing library of e-books that go deeper into the archaeology and history behind the biblical world. You'll find the link to our author page in the description below. Thank you for being here. This story has been told. Subscribe and return to Bible Stories Unearthed. The book is open. Let's unearth more.